Welcome to Module 2, which is all about Astro Components. We're going to take what we know already and build on top of that. And in this module, we're going to do that with a button component. Now, to get started, download the code you'll find down below, and then run npm i and npm run dev to get this up and started. Now, once you do that, you should have a very basic project over here. It's just got an index page, and you can see it says Astro Components, and that's pretty much it. I've got a basic style declaration down this way, and an H1. So that's all we need to know so far. Now, like I mentioned, we're going to build out a button component. So I'm going to come over here to my src directory. We're going to create a new folder here called components. You don't have to name it that, but that's convention. So that's what I'm going to do. And then over here, let's go ahead and create this as button.astro. And notice that I capitalize these. That distinguishes it from the normal button tag in HTML. Now, hopefully at this point, you have an idea of how to do this already, but I could have a button right here. And for now, let's just use a slot. We'll talk about the differences that you've got here in just a second. So to get this actually working, let's pull it in over here, and we're going to pull in button like this, and we'll put something like button text. Sometimes the Astro extension doesn't pull it in, so you might have to manually come up here, but that's okay, we can do that. So we'll say import button from components, and then we'll go to our button.astro. And there we go, we've got our button text. It's just as ugly as you might expect. All right, now, all this is inside of a grid container, which is why it's spread out. Don't worry about the styling right now. I want to talk about this in kind of 3 stages. Number 1, I want to talk about some additional CSS options. Number 2, I want to talk about props versus slots. And lastly, I want to talk about the REST spread operator. So let's start with talking about CSS options. Now, so far, we've seen how you can have a style declaration or class, but notice we've also got this other thing inside of Astro called a class:list. This uses a popular library that allows us to pass in an object. Now, this object is going to have an array where we can pass in multiple different strings of classes. We can also use objects. We can also use arrays, and all of this will be combined into one class declaration. So for instance, maybe we'll say, hey, let's start with the button class. Everything is going to get that. Now down below, you might remember we've got this scoped style section. Because this isn't really a CSS course, I'm just going to paste all this below. Okay, so there's our declaration. If I come up top here, we can now add additional things here. Now, like I mentioned, we can add an array of different classes. So I could say like blue and red or something like that. And now if I come over here and inspect this, you're going to see that it has all those different classes. Let's see right here. So it has blue and red, and I left the comment in there. So it's like this, blue and red. So depending how you're passing things in, you'll notice it passes those in. Now you can also have objects in here. So if I come inside here, we could have something like bordered. We'll have this show only if some value is true. In this case, we're going to make it true. And notice that bordered now shows up over this way. So how would you use stuff like this? Well, let's go ahead and come up top. And I'm going to have this little front matter section, right? Astro's front matter, where we can pass in different props. So let's say we have something called isBordered. And we also have like a class list. And this is all going to be from astro.props. Now, what I can do is pass these things in just like this. So let's say that this is going to be my class list. And bordered will show only if isBordered is true. Now I can do isBordered is true, but if I just say isBordered and it's there, it will be true or not true, right? So right now you can see I don't have it passed in. Class list also doesn't have anything. So the only thing existing now is this btn class. So how would we actually use this? Well, if I come back over here, I can now pass in these different props. Class list, and here we'll do the same thing. So we'll have red and blue, and then we'll have isBordered, and we'll set this thing to true. Now to do an actual Boolean like this, you'll notice that I put it inside of these curly braces. And now over here, I've got bordered or button, red, blue, and isBordered. That seems like you have to spell correctly. Now it says bordered as well. So the way you'd actually use this then is when you pass in certain things, you'd have declarations down here that might change those. So for instance, if you're using something like Tailwind, you might have a list of classes that you can pass in. Now, you can also just pass in a string of classes. So in Tailwind's case, that's probably what I would do. I'd come over here and just have it like this, or I'd pass in red and blue, and that should get passed in just the same. So this classless attribute is really powerful. It can take in strings, it can take in arrays, and it can also take in these kinds of objects. And then you would use those down below to kind of customize how things look. So the classless declaration is one of these new additional options that we haven't talked about. Another one is called CSS vars. Now you can actually pass in stuff from the front matter down to these style tags. You do this with a declaration called define vars, just like that. Now this takes in an object, and then you can have different things that you define down here below. So for instance, let's say I have one called background, and I also have one called color. Now this would be for the background and the color of it, and you'll see that it says, hey, I don't see these being shown up anywhere. So I actually need to destructure them up here as well. So we'll say background, we'll also say color. And now these will be passed down from the Astro props down into the style declaration, which means now I can use them down here below. So for instance, instead of grabbing surface 2 like this, which comes from open props that I've got on this project, I can simply say var background right here. Now we can do the same thing for the color right here and say var color. So how would I actually use these? Well, I would use them like with any other prop that I'm passing in. So let's pull this down just so we can see. You can see my background disappeared, but I could come over here and add something like background, and I'll just grab a random white color, and then let's also take color, and I'll grab like 333. All right, so I can pass in anything I want as a variable here. So obviously it has to be a color since I'm declaring colors in CSS, but then that gets forwarded along to the button. Now the whole point of a component is that it contains a lot of its own styling. So some of the dangers of using CSS variables in this way is now you don't really have a design system. It's just every time you use the button, you pass in whatever you want. So you have to use this sparingly and in really smart ways, but there are ways in which this can be super helpful. So for instance, if I came over here and had white for my button, you might remember that I did have something called var surface 2. So I could pass it in like that and notice that it actually works just fine. So if you do it this way where you're passing in CSS variables, you probably want to have some kind of structured design system in your mind that you're then using to structure these. Like I have 3 surfaces that I can pass in. Now one more thing to note, and this isn't really about CSS, but just about passing in any of these props like this, is you can have defaults, and that's how it works with a lot of different like frameworks. But I can come over here and say I have a default for class list or bordered or any of my other things. So if I come over here, let's say I have this and I say, hey, by default, I want this to be blue and red unless I do something different. Now, obviously, again, we haven't really declared what blue and red do yet, but hopefully you get the point. Background as well. I could say, hey, by default, I want this to be my var surface 2. And I could say by default, I want this to be white. All right, so now I've got defaults that fall back even if I don't have anything I'm passing in. Now, of course, I can come over here to my background and I can pass in something custom if I want. I don't really know what this will be. Looks like a pink color. And that will override my defaults, obviously. Okay, so that's the first thing I wanted to talk about with components using this button as an example. And that is the different CSS options, class list, and also the CSS variables that you can pass in. The second thing I want to talk about is more about the way you think about components. So far, we've got a single component here with a slot that's being dropped in right here. Now, we could pass all these things in as props, and that's kind of the second concept here, props versus slots. So when would you use a prop versus a slot? Generally speaking, I try to let wherever the component is being invoked kind of fill in the details of the component and only use props to pass in key information into the component. Now, depending on the size of your component, this can be named slots, but you might be tempted to come in here and say something like this. I'm going to have like a text for the button here, and maybe I'd also have like an icon for the button down this way. And then you'd obviously have to grab these up here. So you'd have text and you'd have icon, and then you could pass both of those things in. Now notice nothing is here right now, but I could come over here and instead of having all this, I would just now have a button where I'd pass in text and say like, click me. And then I'd have an icon or I'd pass in some kind of icon. But eventually this list gets really, really long, right? Where I've got a text and an icon and CSS variables, and like this just gets unwieldy and hard to work with. So generally speaking, I try to leave the slot to do most of the heavy lifting. Generally speaking, I try to leave a slot in here to do kind of the core content where I can wrap it and have the parent over here kind of show what should be included. So if we go back to what we have button text. That's the core content of this button. And then the wrapper is just essentially the HTML component with a few extra powers on top of it. Now, I should mention one other thing about these props that you can pass in. You can also have something at the very end, and it does need to be at the end of your prop list, called a rest spread operator. Now, the advantage here is I can come over here and simply say, hey, I want to take these rest of these things and spread them right in. Now, I'll have other things on a button like an ID or an ARIA label or all these kinds of things that I might want to pass into the button. However, I don't want to have to define all of those in props. So what I can do is just say, hey, everything else I might want to spread in here, like an ID, I can say like my ID. And then notice how this actually gets passed along as an ID. I might also have an ARIA label, or I'd say like click me button. All right. And then notice the ARIA label click me button shows up down this way. So you can pass in additional things that aren't like listed off in your props, but that will be part of the actual tag, as you can see right here, and they'll just be spread in afterwards. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about JavaScript. Now, in this case, this is a button, and if you're used to working with something like React, you might be tempted to come in here and have like an on-click handler or something like that. But this button component should just essentially be the styling and the content. If you want to interact with this button using client-side JavaScript, you're going to do it where the button is being actually invoked, which would be right here. So I've got my ID, so what I would want to do is have my script tag on this page, since this is where my ID is actually being shown, right? So I'd have a script right here, and I'll have document.querySelector, we'll have my ID, we'll just add an event listener for a click, we'll just alert, clicked. All right, so now this will happen where the button is actually being invoked. So if I come over here and I click, it says clicked. Now, if I were to move this over this way, and I drop it in down this way, what do you think is going to happen? If I come over here, and I click clicked, it still works. However, the ID over here isn't visible in any way. So I don't know where this is being invoked, and it happens to be on my home page, but it could be anywhere else. How many my IDs do I have? I don't even know. So you're not going to pass in JavaScript into this component. Anything that's in this component will run, right? But it's just the visibility isn't quite there. So when would you use a script tag in a component? Well, when that component contains everything you need right here visibly to be interacted with the script. So for instance, maybe you have like an accordion component that you build out, and the accordion component already has everything in it style-wise and then script-wise to where it kind of controls all of its own stuff. In that case, you probably wouldn't have an ID you're clicking on, but rather a class like accordion. So it makes sense to have that class here, and it also makes sense to have the script here that controls it. So the way I think about it is if whatever I'm calling to actually do the JavaScript exists in the component where I'm using it, so that would be right here, then I would do it in the script tag here. So if it's a class that I'm calling, I would do it right here because it contains everything I need. If, however, like in this case, I'm passing in some custom thing, like an ID, I'm going to do that script tag right over here. That way I know exactly there's visibility into it. Where I'm actually calling the button is where I'm describing the script that controls it. And not to belabor the point, but if we were to come over here and change this to like my ID2, and I come and refresh, you'll see if I click here, nothing happens, right? Because over here, I'm looking for my ID, and over here, I've named it my ID2. So I might be over here in the button saying like, why isn't this thing working? Now, of course, I could have like a class declaration, and that's when I would typically do the script in here. When every single time this component is clicked or interacted with, I want it to do something, no matter where it's being used, then I would do the script tag directly in here, but obviously it would need to be some kind of class or data attribute, something that isn't custom to the individual invocation of that component, like an ID, right? Because that should only be once per page. Obviously, in this case, I don't want to have like query selector all and move on from there, but you can see that the same thing now would actually happen, right? I'd actually get the click because this is, I know, going to be on this button no matter what, right? Because I'm not having to pass this in. It's kind of baked into the component. So we've talked about some extra CSS declarations. We've talked about props versus slots, and we've talked a little bit about JavaScript. Now, in the next lesson, what we're going to do is talk about a few more options you have with components, like passing in raw HTML, dynamic tags, and more. I'll see you there. In the last lesson, we built out this Astro button component, and we talked about 3 additional options you have with components. In this lesson, I want to talk about 4 different options you have, and we're going to start with HTML and fragments. So if I come over here, we've got this button right here, and I may want to slot in some HTML. Now, this becomes especially important when you're using things like a CMS, you're getting some kind of unknown HTML from somewhere, and you might want to slot that into a component. Now, that probably would not be a button component, but that's a separate issue. So let's say we come up top here, and let's just pretend we're getting this from some kind of like CMS, right? So let's grab this, we'll call it like HTML equals, and we'll just say strong hi. All right, so what I could do is come over here, and you might think you could just drop this in directly here. But Astro is going to do something to protect you, and that is it's going to recognize this is HTML and not let you insert that. So this is a protection mechanism, but you might say, I know what this is, I want to insert it anyhow. Well, you can do that with something called the setHTML directive. Now, there's a few different ways to do this, but for instance, I could come over here and say setHTML, just like that, and then pass in my HTML. Now, I'll go ahead and get rid of the stuff in the middle here, and you'll see that it actually passes this in as a strong tag. So you actually do this in the front part of any component or any tag technically as well. So I could come over here and have a paragraph and say setHTML and simply pass in HTML, and it will do the same thing. Now, let's go back to when it was in a slot right over here. Now, I might want to pass this in right here as HTML, but I don't want to add some extra wrappers. In other words, I could do like a div right here, where I say div set HTML, and then I pass in the HTML and I close out the div. The problem is I've now added an extra div where I don't need it. Now if I come over here, you'll notice this button right here, I've got a button, and then inside the button, I've got a div, and inside the div, I've got a strong tag, but I don't really need this div here. In this case, I might want to say, I don't need this extra wrapper. It could even mess up my styling. In this case, I've got flex on the button. I don't have flex here. So if I were to have two things next to each other, let's say in this HTML, I also had like a paragraph that said like, yo, and we close this off. And just to make sure that this is going to work well, let's make this a paragraph as well. So now I've got this in a wrapper, and notice they're not next to each other, they're stacking. And that's because my CSS has display flex on the button, but now I've got this random like wrapper right here, this random div that's kind of overriding that CSS, right? It's its own little parent container, and it doesn't have any kind of styling on it. So a lot of times what you'll see is using what's called a fragment. Fragment like this. And now notice what's going to happen. They're going to stack next to each other. And if I come over here and I expand the button, I just got these two things here directly. So the fragment allows you to do things like this without adding in extra HTML. So that's the first thing, raw HTML and fragments. Secondly, I want to talk about dynamic tags. Now we could do this with a button component, but I think it makes more sense with something else. So I'm going to say click me, just get it back that way. And we're going to come over here and create what's called a heading component. So a heading like this, .astro. Now if I have a heading component, I want maybe an H1, or maybe I want an H2 or an H3, and it'd be nice to contain all of that in this heading directly. So secondly, we're going to talk about these dynamic tags. What you can do is pass in a tag name like H1 or H2, and then dynamically display that down below. Now, if I were to come over here and we were to pass this in, right? So if I said like tag, we got this from astro.props, and then I came down here and said tag, you might think that this would work, right? So I'd come in here and have a slot, and let's jump over to the index. I'm just going to pull this down here and rename both of these. And then let's come down here. And for this heading here, we're going to replace this with my heading. Now you might think I could pass in a tag like this and say something like H2. Now here's the trouble. If I come over here and I inspect this, you'll notice it just says tag, lowercase. Why is that? Well, one of the best and worst things about HTML is that you can pass in any custom tag you want, right? So I could come over here and have a tag called pizza. And I could say hi, and you'll notice it just says pizza, right? You can pass in anything you want. That's a good thing and a bad thing. So over here, when I have tag lowercase, notice it's not actually even pulling from here. You can see that a little bit in the styling of this component. It says it's never being used. And that's because this is a valid HTML tag. So if you're going to pass in custom dynamic tags, you need to do this in a few different steps. Number one, you pass in some kind of name. I've done that here. Number two, you have to reassign this to an uppercase tag name. So here I might say something like custom tag, and notice it's uppercase. And then I would reassign this to tag. Then I would use custom tag down this way, custom tag. And now notice that my custom tag is being passed in. And notice it's an H2 because that's what we've passed in over this way. So we've talked about HTML and fragments. We've talked about passing in dynamic tags. Thirdly, I want to talk a little bit more about the construction of a component by thinking about decoupling styling from something like a semantic tag. So in this case, I might have like an H3 or I might have an H4, and this gets passed in properly over this way. The trouble, however, is that my styling isn't necessarily always going to be reflective of the tag. In other words, I might have an H4 or an H3 that I actually want to be really, really big. But notice my styling right now is just tied to the tag. If I have an H1, it's big, an H2, it's a little smaller, H3, etc. So how do we decouple these things? Now there's lots of libraries that help you do this. And in fact, we'll probably look at one of these later on in the course. But for right now, I just want to do this in a simple object and kind of conceptually understand what we're trying to do. We're trying to decouple the styling from the semantic tag. So let me declare an option we're going to call sizes. Now this will use the same semantic name so I don't have to remember, and we'll have an H1, H2, etc. And then for each of these, I'm simply going to declare some kind of class size. So to make this extra simple, let's just name them all H1 through whatever. And now what I can do is use these sizes down this way to declare custom styles down here. So let's refresh some of the stuff we learned last time, and then we'll add those. So I could have a class list directive, and maybe I have inside of this array something called default. That will be there for every single one. Next, I might want to pass in my sizes, right? So let's take in addition to the tag, a size. And the size is going to be H1, H2, H3, H4, whatever, right? So we're decoupling the tag from the size. So to come over here for my sizes and just pick off whatever size I've passed in. So that will be the next class that is added. But let's spread in a rest operator and take that in up here. Remember, it has to be the last thing in your list of props. That way we can pass in an ID or anything else we want to this. Now down this way, we're going to have a default class. And maybe this is just like a line height of 1.1, so everything gets that. And maybe text, wrap, balance. I usually like to add these to headings as well. So down this way, we're just going to have class declarations for H1, H2, H3, and H4. And these will just be different font sizes. All right, and again, because this is not a CSS course, I'm just going to paste all this in, but you can see it's just basically graduating the sizes from the largest, which would be an H1, down to the smallest, which is an H6. But these are classes rather than tag declarations. So now I know that this will be passed in here as an H1, H2, H3, whatever. So I'm going to use this that I pass in, and this will be the returned result, right? So you can name this like extra, extra large, large, whatever, and have those be your class names, whatever works for you. So if I come back over here, now we've got our tag. It's its own separate thing. Then I'm also going to pass in a size. This size will be H1 if I want it to be the biggest. And you can see there it is. H2 will be a little smaller, H3, H4, H5. And that way my tag can be what it needs to be semantically, and my size can be something separate. So that's another thing to think about when you're building out components. The fourth thing I want to talk about is looping through and displaying several components from one declaration. Now this can happen when you're pulling in data from the CMS, or maybe just some local data file as well, or something like Astro's content collections, which we'll look at in a later module. But if I come over here, let's go ahead and declare const headings, and I'm just going to paste this in. So we've got three different objects with the tag, with the size, and then whatever text I want to be in that slot. Essentially, this is going to be practice for what we've already seen, but now you get a chance to actually loop over data again. So I'll come down this way, and let's copy this for now so we can reuse it. First thing we need to do, curly brackets, right? Because we're going to be looping over things using JavaScript. I'm going to then take my headings, dot, map, and I want to map over each heading. Now I can name these whatever I want. We'll just call it heading. And then if I come down here, here's where we want to actually use our component. Now we'll talk about this in a second, but notice how it wrapped it in parentheses. That just makes it easier to see we're returning this component, which is what I want. Now these can all be dynamic, right? So if I come in here with heading dot, it should give me all of those in the IntelliSense. Here, we're going to start with the tag. Same thing here for the size. So heading dot size. And then finally here, this is going to be heading dot text. And notice that it's going to print all those out. We've got heading 1, heading 2, and heading 3. Now this is semantically an H1, right? An H2 and an H4, but the sizes are all decoupled. And that's what we did in the last little section here. Now if I come back over this way, I want to talk a little bit more about these parentheses. If you're used to working with JSX, this looks very familiar. If you're not, you're going to be really tempted to come in here and use curly brackets, and then nothing works, and you're going to be frustrated, and you're not going to know what's going on. So let me try to get this kind of mentally explained here. So that way you don't have to run into that. Right here, nothing's happening. I'm returning. Why isn't this doing anything? Well, it's because I'm actually not returning. I'm simply declaring here this map, and then nothing is ever being returned here. So if I want to return this, I need to actually return it. And probably the easiest way, just to avoid like the automatic semicolon insertion here, is to wrap it in parentheses and then return the component, right? That's what it was doing up top here, is doing an implicit return and wrapping it all in parentheses. Now, sometimes it's actually helpful to have an explicit return like this, where you use curly brackets and then return inside of some parentheses, whatever JSX you want. And when that's helpful is when you want to do extra stuff inside of here. Now in this case, you wouldn't need it because it's such a simple component, but just for an example here, I could have like const uppercase, and then this would just be taking my heading.text.to local uppercase like this, and then I could pass in this uppercase text down this way. So in other words, you can actually do JavaScript directly in here. Now, obviously in this case, I'd probably just grab it like this and do it directly here. There's no reason to have this extra const declaration. But sometimes when you're looping through data, you want to actually extract out a few things where you'll use it in several different items within the component. So it makes sense to actually do some JavaScript before you go ahead and return from your mapped item. So you can do more logic before you return the component. Now, one more quick thing that I have mentioned before, and that is that this is not like React JSX. So you don't need a key right here, right? Since we're mapping over multiple items, if you're used to working with React, you're going to think you need a key. You don't need that. That's because we just have static HTML. You're not tracking things across React, right, as it diffs certain things. Secondly, you can have multiple components that you're returning. So it doesn't have to be a single parent component. So I could have like a paragraph that says like pre-heading right here. I can have two siblings stacked right next to each other. So we've seen a lot of powerful things already about components in this module. I want now to think about how we can add some type safety to this, because I am passing in H1, H2, H3 here, but I could pass in literally anything. So let's go back to pizza because that seems to be on the mind. You'll notice that this now is declaring pizza. So I've got no type safety here at all. And that's what I want to add in the next module. How do we add type safety to our components? We mentioned in the last lesson that we have no type safety currently. That's why I've got a pizza tag and it's being passed along here. What I want is for this to only be able to be like the H1, H2, H3. Now we had been looping through heading dot tag right here. So that way we've got H1s, H2s, and H4s based on this object we passed in. So how do we get type safety to ensure that I can only use the exact values I want for each of the props I'm passing in? Well, we're going to do that with TypeScript, and it's built in by default into Astro. I'm going to come over this way, and I've got a TS config, and right now I've got this set to base. I'm going to go ahead and switch this over to strict, and then you might need to actually restart the dev server if it doesn't do that for you, so let's go ahead and do that. And now what it's going to do is use the strict configuration, which means we can use type safety in our components. So if I come over here, you'll notice I'm already starting to get some stuff right here where it's yelling at me because now I'm not actually like defining these types and it doesn't know what size is and all that kind of stuff. So what we're going to do is use a helper by Astro to help define and then declare what these types should be. We'll do import, and this needs to be a type of HTML attributes, and that comes from Astro /types. Now I can define an interface that extends any HTML attribute. So we'll say interface, and we're going to call it props, and then we'll just say it extends HTML attributes, and then we're going to pass in something here as a generic. Basically, this is almost like a little function. It's taking in any HTML attribute, which is why you see an anchor link there. And I can come in here and grab an H1, for instance. Now, this interface allows us to then pass in our own custom things as well. So I could pass in a tag. All right, now we'll just say that this could be anything. I'll pass in a size, and that's the same thing. And then, I don't know, we could have classes or other things. So let's say we pass in classes, and this is a string, which means I need to take in classes down here. Although technically, I guess the REST spread operator would take care of that, but we don't really have it set up to do that. So now I'm saying it needs a tag, it needs sizes, and it needs classes. Now, you can't use that to declare this, so we'll look at that in a second. But for now, if I come over here, you'll notice that I've actually got a new problem. And that is that it's saying, hey, you don't actually have classes defined here, even though you say it should have classes. So if I come over here, you'll notice just by it doing an empty string, it's now happy. So whenever you have an optional type, you're going to come over here and just make sure that in the interface or the type, you have it here as optional, which you could do with a little question mark. Now, you don't have to understand everything about TypeScript to get the value right here. This is pretty much all you need to get most of the value out of using TypeScript in components. You can see here I'm extending an interface. This is kind of actually almost an advanced use case because you could just have a type like this, right? Where you come over here and you just say type props equals, or you could do interface. That works as well. This is all you really need to get the value. But in this case, we're going to tie it to the actual HTML entity of H1, H2, all the way through H6. And what you're doing is declaring these props, and then this will then be used down below. Now, by naming it props, Astro kind of automatically connects it to this, but I could name this like pizza or something like that, and then I would actually have to connect this in some way. You can see how here now it's saying it's not used, whereas if I name it props, Astro does that automatically. So that's what I typically do. I'll come back over this way. Let's move back to where we have now an interface that's extending the HTML attribute for H1, H2, H3. Now in this case, H1, H2, H3, they kind of all have the same props, but the reason we would do it this way is because if I come back over here, I can now pass in extra things, but only things that would be valid on an H1 tag. So for instance, if I try to do checked, it's not going to let me do checked. That's only for an input with the type of checkbox, but I could do aria checked. So again, it's only going to let me do things that are valid on this particular attribute. Now, like I mentioned, in this case, we actually have multiple ones. So I could come over here and say like H1, H2, and those are kind of both the same, right? They can all accept the same stuff. But I could use TypeScript if you want to go one step further and add key of, type of, and then we could do sizes. Now, that's a little confusing, but basically what I'm saying is it has to be an H1, H2, H3. It has to be one of these right here. So I'm saying it has to be a type of one of these sizes and one of their keys. Now, technically, that's actually what we're going to use for here as well. So now these have to be one of these. And notice that my error goes away down here because it knows this is an H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, or H6. So here's the really cool thing. When we come over here to actually invoke this, here you can see that these are just typed as strings right now, and that's because I'm looping through these, and it could be any string up here. So it doesn't know that it's an H1, H2, even though they're all valid. So I'm not going to type that object up front right now. All I want to do is get rid of this. we're going to grab this right here and redeclare it just to show how this actually works in practice. For this tag, notice as soon as I come inside here and start to declare this, it's going to give me all those options in my IntelliSense. So now I know what my sizes or my tags happen to be. So here I'd say like H3, that's fine. And then I could say like hi or something, right? So I get all that IntelliSense directly here, which is really, really nice. Especially the more complex these components get, that IntelliSense becomes invaluable to you. I've also got things like my classes right here, but notice it's optional and it says it's a string or undefined, but I could pass something in here as well, like red, and then I'd obviously have to handle that in the component. So that's the kind of the basics of using TypeScript, especially around HTML components, right? So this is essentially a component that replaces 6 HTML attributes, and I want to make sure that I extend them so that I can pass along only the types of attributes that are connected to those particular HTML entities, those tags. Now, so far we've been working with just classic HTML. In the next module, I want to talk about using UI frameworks. This is called Astro Islands, and you can use things like React or Vue or Svelte, or we're going to start to explore that in the next lesson. So in this module, we've built out several components already, and hopefully you get a sense of kind of all the superpowers available to you in Astro Components. However, you may come from another UI framework where you're bringing your own components already, and you don't have to rewrite everything in Astro. You can have these Astro Islands of interactivity. So in other words, your entire page may be static, but you may have little sections that need to be hydrated. So the way this works in Astro is when you build your site, it'll actually build all the static stuff, and then it'll just hydrate the individual components that you need hydrated with JavaScript. So for instance, if you're writing React, it'll send over all the HTML to start with. So it actually builds that, but it won't hydrate it with the necessary React until you scroll to that section of the page or give it some directive to tell it, hey, I want you to hydrate this. It allows you to keep your site fast by default and then just hydrate with JavaScript when you need it. I'm going to use React as my framework of choice because that's what I'm most comfortable in, but this is just an example of how you can use a UI framework. Now there's a bunch of other ones you can use, so if you use Svelte or Vue, you can use those in here as well, and I'll leave you to fill out the rest. Now, I'm not really going to focus a lot on React or these other UI frameworks because the point is to make you comfortable with Astro. I'm assuming if you want to use one of those frameworks, you're already comfortable there, and the simple directives I'll show you right now should be enough to get you started. So let's go ahead and get started by coming over to the index route. And I just want to add a bunch of extra paragraphs. That way we kind of get this off screen. So let's come over here. We're going to say paragraph like lorem 30, and I'll just multiply this like 30 times. All right, so we've got a bunch of paragraphs here, and that way whatever we're going to do is going to be off screen. Now right here, I want to add a counter component. So the first thing I want to do is come over to my components. We're going to call this counter.tsx. And then I'm going to go ahead and just paste in all of this JavaScript. Pretty easy to get started with. Now, right now you'll see that it can't find React, so I actually need to install React to use it in this project. Once again, the Astro CLI comes to help. We're going to do Astro add, and we'll do React. This will install React. It'll update my Astro config and update my tsconfig.json. npm run dev gets us back up and running. So now I can actually use React in my project. So let's come over here and let's import it just like we would any other component. We're going to grab the counter just like that and drop it in here. Now, the cool thing is you see it shows right here. I can click increment and decrement, but notice nothing is happening. And that's the first thing you need to know is that with these UI frameworks, what you're doing is you're rendering the HTML with Astro, but in order to actually hydrate it with JavaScript, you have to use certain directives. So I want to talk about just 4. There are a couple other ones, but these are probably going to be the ones you use. First of all, if I do client load, this is going to load it immediately on the client. So as soon as the page loads, it will hydrate this with JavaScript, even if it's off page or whatever. So I can now come in here and it should increment and decrement, and that's all keeping track of everything with React. Secondly, we've got client idle. I'd use client load for something that's like very important to be interactive above the fold. Client idle could be for something that just needs to load eventually after everything else is done. This will hydrate the component with JavaScript once everything else is done. Now, the one I typically use is called client visible. Now, this is a really cool one. If I come up top here, let's go ahead and refresh. And I want to open up the DevTools to show you what it's going to do. Because a lot of the times, the UI components, they're going to be way further down on the page, and I may never actually make those interactive. And I don't want to load all of React if I'm never going to actually see that in the viewport. So notice here I've got 50 requests, and as I scroll down, eventually this component should get in the viewport, and as soon as that happens, you'll notice it hydrates the component with React at that point. So this is typically what I do, because really I don't need React to be there unless it's going to be interacted with. Now I can come over here and increment and decrement. Now there is one other one, and that's called client only. Now the important thing about this is you have to actually give it a value, and this would be the name of the framework. So in this case, React. And what this will do is not only hydrate it with JavaScript, it'll actually create the HTML as well with JavaScript. This directive is especially helpful with more complex components where you really need React to control the entire thing. At this point, you should know enough about working with Astro Components to actually build out a section of a web page. And that's what we're going to do for the rest of this module, is take an exercise of building out a pricing component where we get to put a lot of our knowledge into practice. I hope you're ready to put everything you've been learning into practice. Now, there's a few things you need to know ahead of time. Number one, you can download the starter code below and then go ahead and get it up and running in VS Code or whatever you happen to be using. Secondly, I do want you to place the pricing section right here. And then thirdly, I want to preview the README with you because that will give you all the instructions you need to do exactly that. So let's come over here. And this README right here gives you everything you need and kind of walks you through possible options. So you can extend this if you want to as well. I've got the preview over this way, but you can see that you can use the data file in SRC data to just import everything. And I'll show you how to do that in just a second. So that way you're not having to type all of this yourself. Second here, consider which sections of the card you want to further turn into components. Now this is kind of up to you as your project grows, but for instance, you may want to have like these buttons be their own component. You may want to have this list be its own component, or further, you could have these individual items be their own components. We will probably make different decisions there, and that's totally fine. Usually those are things you refactor as you go along, so just do what you think is right, and then I'm sure you'll change as you go, as I would if I were to do it again. Thirdly here, you can optionally add TypeScript declarations, and I'll show you how to do that in a later video. And then finally, you can also optionally style this if you're interested in that. Again, if you're like, I don't care, I just want to focus on Astro, skip those videos, you're totally fine. Now, if you do want to style it, here's a basic style guide of what I used. So let's do two more things before I send you to do it yourself. Number one, I want to remind you how you can import data. So I'll get rid of that. And we've got the data in the file over there, so we're just going to do import, and I can call this whatever I want, but we'll just call it data. Maybe we can call it cards, how about that? From, and I'm going to go up a level to data, and then inside here to card data.json. If I come over here and I console log this, you should see I get all that stuff right here. And the nice thing is it's typed as well. So if I were to come in here and try to map over each card, I could grab the card dot, and it should give me all of those different properties here. So that's really nice. These imports carry along with them all the types. The last thing I want to do is remind you the different CSS options you have. Now, you'll remember that styles inside of components are automatically scoped to that component. So if you build out a button component, for instance, all of those styles will be scoped to it by default. Secondly, if you have a style tag anywhere and you want to use something like Sass, you can do that with this lang declaration. Here you can do Sass or less or whatever you happen to prefer to use. You just need to make sure to install that as well, and Astro will remind you of that. Finally, you might be interested in using Tailwind. If you are, remember there's a great CLI command. We can just do npx astro add Tailwind like that, and it will walk you through the entire process. So those are some options you have with CSS. Of course, you can also always have a global file that you import. So maybe you'd have some global declarations that you would import right here. And let's see, it's up in styles and then global.css. Obviously, this file doesn't exist, but this would be globally available anywhere I'm using this page. In this case, it's the only page on my site, so everything on my site is going to get this global declaration. So with the knowledge you have, go ahead and try to build out this component. If you need the actual picture, it's right over here, and you can just do your best. As far as spacing and all that, I'll leave that to you. Again, really try to focus in on Astro, and if you want to do the extra stuff, go for it. But the important thing is to really try it yourself. Hopefully at this point it makes sense and you feel like you can do it. That means I taught it well, but if you can actually do it, means you've learned it well. So the actual process of doing it yourself is going to be super important. Okay, go for it, and then I'll see you in the next video. Hope you are ready to build out this pricing card component. Now we're going to do everything right here, but first of all, let's go ahead and create inside of our SRC directory, a components directory. And then inside here, let's create something. We'll just call it pricing card.astro. Now, eventually we're going to have some kind of probably article in here, and we'll have like pricing. And let's just put pricing card for now so we can actually see that it's working. Now we're going to loop over all these and we'll put it in some kind of a section. So let's go ahead and do something like section, and I'll give this an ARIA label. We'll call it like pricing. And then inside here is where we're going to loop over all of our data. Now remember, anytime we do templating, what do we need? We need those curly brackets. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll take my cards.map. I'm going to map over each card, which I will call a card. You can call it whatever you want. And then what we're going to do is pass it to our pricing cards. Pricing card right there, and we'll pull this in. So we should have 3 pricing cards, and that's exactly what we've got here. Now I want some global CSS just to kind of get this stuff central. So let's create a little file. Let's come over here. We're going to have styles. then I'll have a global import for just kind of the basic styles. So we'll say global.css, and I'll start with a very basic box sizing border box, and then maybe let's do margin 0 and padding 0. That's what I like to typically do because I usually use grid parents and let them kind of control the spacing. So that's a controversial decision. You don't have to do that, but we should be able to see here in a second, once I add especially like a font family declaration, that let's use system UI. Yeah, just like that. All right, so we're gonna use our system UI, and when I hook this up, we should actually see a difference, and that's really what I want to see. So let's come over here. We're gonna import here from our styles, global CSS. There we go, and you can see stuff actually changed, which is good. Now also probably put stuff in the very middle, so let's come over here again. We'll just have a body here, display grid, and then place content center. And that way everything will be in the center of the screen. Finally, let's have a min height. We'll do 100 VH. And then just for good measure, let's have some padding on the entire site. We'll do like 1.5 rem. Okay, so you can't see that, but it is actually working for us. All right, so there's some basic styling, so I won't go totally insane, but I'm gonna try to stick now to the actual content. So we're gonna open up this pricing card, and the first thing I wanna do is kind of scaffold out what I want this to look like. So let's open up this pricing card component right here, and let's split it. We'll go full screen and move this over, and that way we can kind of think through what we might want this to look like. I'm gonna zoom in right here. You'll notice that pretty much all these are the same. All right, the only difference is the colors. And then right here, we've got an extra little badge. And I guess there's also not a month on this 0, right? Other than that, it's all the exact same. So let's kind of scaffold this out one thing at a time using the data we know we get right here. So I'll open up pricing cards, and this is where we're going to do it. And we might as well go ahead and pull in all the data. We'll call this, I don't know, let's call it card data. We'll get this from astro.props. So let's come over here, and we now need this to say card data. We're going to pass in for each of these the whole card. All right, so now over here, I should get all that right here. Now we have yet to actually have any kind of typing here, so you can see it just says any. This is where TypeScript would be really helpful, but I'm going to try to leave that alone and just come over here and let's maybe capture this so I don't have to remember what each of these things are called as we go through it. And I'll bring it up here, but I'm not using TypeScript yet, okay? This just looks like TypeScript, but it's not. Okay, so now that we've got that, let's destructure all this from the card data. So if I grab card data like this is what's being passed in. I can now destructure everything I need from there. So that would be our tier, most popular, etc. Okay, so we've got all that in there. I saved it, and now we can actually use this down below. So the tier is that top section up here. So let's just kind of scaffold this out for now. So I'm just going to keep this really basic. We'll have a paragraph here, and this will simply say tier. Now I should be able to see this now. So let's actually do that. So there you go. We got free, pro, and enterprise, and then we'll keep this right here in the middle. Now only this middle one has the badge of most popular. And if I come up here to the TypeScript that's totally not TypeScript, you can see that's just going to be true or false. So it's a Boolean, which means what I need to do is check to see if it exists. Now we can do that with a ternary operator. And again, we would do that inside of these curly brackets. So all I'm going to do is check if most popular is here. So if most popular is here, then I'm going to have a paragraph that will say most popular. All right, so just the middle one has it. Now it is a little hard to actually see kind of what each card has. So why don't we do just a little bit of CSS if you don't mind for now. So I'm going to come inside here and we're going to grab each of the articles. We're just going to say padding like 0.5 rem. Let's do a border of 2 pixels, solid and black. So we're not actually styling this, but at least you can kind of see what's going on. Finally, let's come over here and make sure that we add some kind of like styling for the section itself. So I could grab the section tag, but assuming you use this somewhere else, so we should probably use something a little bit more specific. So let's grab this ARIA label, and we'll just say that anything that has that pricing label should be display of flex. We'll do like a gap of 1.5 rem, and then flex wrap of wrap. Hopefully you'll forgive the little bit of CSS there. And I guess let's also do align items flex start. And that way everything starts at the top. Okay, cool. So back over here, what we were doing, let's now build this section out. Now if I come up top here, I've got an amount per month, and this should just be a number. So that would be like my 8 or my 0 or my 12 or whatever it happens to be. I've got a $sign, then I've got the number, and then on some of these, I have this month thing. So let's come and think about how we want this to look. All of this, since it's kind of in the middle here, will probably be inside a div. The actual pricing section will be inside of another div. Here I'll have a span. This will be this $sign, and then probably another span, and this will actually be our amount. So amount per month right there. And then lastly here, you'll notice that this one and the 12 one should actually have a month following it, whereas the 0 one does not. So I can just check to make sure it's more than 0. So let's do another ternary operator. we'll say amount per month. If that's more than 0, then I want to add one more span. Then I want to add one more span, which I can do with this double ampersand. And this will just be amount per month. All right, so that works. All right, next we've actually got the title, I think it is. Is that right? Yeah, the title is next. So this would still be inside of this kind of wrapper div, but not inside of this pricing div. So let's cut that down there. Come down here. This would probably be like an H1 or H2. This would probably be like an H2 or H3, kind of depending on where this sits in your page. I'm just going to hard code this as an H3. You may want to build this out as a heading component, but let's go ahead and add the title right here. Next, we've got the description. That's just going to be a paragraph tag, and description right here. So below that group, we've got another section here. This will be our button. We'll build out a component for this in just a second, but for now, let's just add it, and then we'll do that in a second. All right, so let's go ahead and get rid of the image since we know what we want. We're going to have a div here. This is where all of our features will live. So these will be stacked probably in some kind of grid container, and I'll just check the features, and then for each of these, we'll have a map where we'll grab the feature, which I'll just call F, and I'll go ahead and return a div. Now this div should have two things. It should have an icon up top, and then it should also have like the text, right? So let's do the text first. This should be simple. It's just a paragraph, and we'll grab the F dot title, I think. Yeah, there we go. And we've also got the icons right here. Now you might remember that those are actually in our README file. So if I come over here, I should be able to grab this right here. We'll open this up, and then also we've got the X as well. All right, so over here, let's see, let's grab this right here, and we should be able to just copy this SVG. So let's come over here, and we're gonna check off of this icon. So you might remember it's a Boolean. I think it was dot checked. So if this is true, then I want to return this SVG right here, right? Otherwise, I want to return the other SVG, the X. So let's come over here, and I think it may have been this one. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this right here. And I guess we could just do this in one declaration. So I could say if it's checked, then we'll do that. Otherwise, we're going to come in here and do this one. Okay, so let's come back over here and just double check. Yep, that's the case. It's all working properly. All right, I promised we would go back and do this button component as kind of a separate thing. You can ignore this TypeScript if you want to, and I'll also get rid of all this as well since we don't need that right now, since technically we're not doing TypeScript. I just didn't want to remember what all those were called. So let's extract this button component out into its own component file. So I'll say button.astro, button right here, and then we'll go ahead and grab our slot, and let's go ahead and use our custom button one instead of that. So I'll say button. For some reason, it doesn't want to import. That's all right. I'll come up here. We'll import button from, we'll go to components and then button. Okay, so it looks the exact same. We would expect that because we're not really doing styling yet. But let's go ahead and add in an ID. For here, let's go ahead and take perhaps the tier. So I'm going to take the tier and I'm just going to lowercase it like that. We'll pass that along to the button. Now, if we were to inspect, you'll notice it's actually not going to be there right now. So right here, you'll see it's got no ID. That's because I need to pass this along. Let's grab the rest right here from astro.props, and then we will pass this along right here. Now, it's not typed yet or anything like that. We'll do that in a later video, but I can spread that in, and now the ID should come along. ID free, ID pro, whatever the tier happens to be. Very, very basic button implementation, but hopefully that makes sense. And again, you could ignore this TypeScript error for now. So we've got all the data in here. And the next video, I want to show how you can extend this with TypeScript if you want to. So one more extra here. Let's go ahead and style this all out. Now I'm going to come over here to my global CSS and just replace a lot of this with some custom styling. I've essentially set up like a little mini kind of design system where I've got all the different colors, which you can grab in the README, some shadows that we'll use, font families and weights, spacings, border radius, font family, kind of basic stuff on the body. Now we also need to actually add enter somewhere, and I'm going to add it on my index file right here in the head. If I come over to my README and I look here, you'll see I've just got one weight, and that is the semi-bold. You can grab this from anywhere you want. I've got this nice helper in Raycast. I'm just going to look at enter right here. And we've got semi-bold, and I should be able to grab the HTML link right here. Next, what I want to do is grab this section right here. We're going to do a little bit more right here. I'm just seeing that I removed my body declaration from my global style, so let's put it back here. Now, I might as well do the same kind of spacing down here for my gap as well. That way, those are really consistent. And then finally, even though you can't quite see here, we're going to justify content center. So that way, when the screen gets bigger, they'll stay in the very center of the screen, just like that. I think this declaration here will also force them into the center, but that way, no matter where they're at, they'll try to be in the center of their container. Okay, cool. Next, let's come into the pricing card. We've got a bunch of things to style here, and we're going to have to give these things some kind of classes as well. So let's come up top here. First of all, we're going to give this the class of tier. Now, there's a couple different ways I can style this, but if I open back up the pricing card, you'll see that it's just at the very top, right? And everything else is spaced out fairly evenly. So I think what I'll probably tend to do here would be to make this position absolute and just force it all the way to the top. Now that means we need to make some changes on the actual article card, and we might as well style that too before we get going too far. So let's come down this way. I'm going to come down to my article declaration, and we're going to change several things here. I'll simply paste all this in, but we'll talk through it here. We've got some variables declared on the global here for our background color, the different shadows we might use, the border radius. We're going to make this display grid, add a gap, and do some spacing all around. Now importantly here, I've got a position of relative, and that way I can absolutely position this top section. Now, if I come over here, you'll notice that this one has the dark shadow. Everything else has the light shadow. So we can use something we've already played with before, but haven't done too much with. And that is the class list declaration, because this allows us to use objects inside of here to show or hide certain classes. So I'll use class list, and then this is an array once again. And I simply want to add the class dark shadow here to the article. And that would be whenever we have most popular, right? So just for that center one, most popular. Whenever that's true, I want to add dark shadow. So now this one right here should have a class of dark shadow. Now let's come back down this way. I'm going to go ahead and grab this right here. We're just going to say if an article also has the class of dark shadow. Now that we've got native CSS nesting, I can just drop this in here, and this will be shadow dark. So right over here, let's just double check that this actually has the class of dark shadow. It does, which means I probably just messed this up, which I did. All right, so it needs to be and dark, so not a child class, but actually a class on the article. Okay, cool. So now we're set up to actually use our tier, right? So we had that class up top here of tier. I'm going to close this down just because it's really long to scroll all the way to the top. Okay, so let's go ahead and grab our tier. And once again, I'm just going to paste this in where we've got position absolute. It's going to be full width. The text will be in the center. We've got some padding on the block, which is up and down. And then we've got some border radiuses that should match the ones we've got on the card. Now notice here I'm using a local declaration for the background color, kind of a local variable, because we can override this depending on which tier it's in. So the next thing I want to do is grab Pro, Enterprise, or Free and attach that as an additional item that I can play off of. So let me come up top here, and right inside here, the way I'm going to handle this is using our class list as well. So let's come in here with class list. This is going to be an object where we've got an array. Everything should get tier, right? But then on top of that, I want to add it in a class, which would just be the tier dot to lowercase. So that would be Pro or Enterprise or whatever. Now I can use that down below to add that custom class and then style it accordingly. So let's come back down this way. I don't need to do anything for free, but for the Pro tier, I'm going to go ahead and just paste in this color change, right? So it's going to override the default one here. For Enterprise, we're going to do the same thing. Here we'll have yellow instead, and you can see that now that shows right across the top. So a really nice way to use local CSS variables. Obviously, you might be styling with Tailwind or something else. This is just how I would tend to set this up. Now next we've got this most popular badge, and it's only on one card, but if I come back up top here, look at this, it expanded on us again. I should be able to come in here, and we're going to add a class of badge. So down below here, let's go ahead and add that class of badge, and I'll paste in these things. We just got a background color, the color of the text, some padding. We're going to make it only as big as it can be since it is a child of a grid container. It will stretch the full width if we don't do that. We'll make sure it's in the center, text transform uppercase, and font size of extra small. And once again, my nesting is messing me up. I put that inside the tier. We don't want that. So just like that. Okay, cool. Now we've got these details right here. We probably need to add some kind of class on this section. And then we've got like the amount, we've got the title, we've got the description, and then we've got this section down here. Now the button itself will actually style in the button component. So let's come up top here though and work on those other items. So it's this one right, let's see, right here, right? Yeah, so this right here, let's go ahead and give this some kind of a name. So I'll call this details. And then this is the little wrapper for the amount. So let's call this amount. The span itself, we can call it something like sign. The amount, let's just call this num. And the nice thing is because this is all scoped, I don't have to think of like clever names. I can just name it exactly what it looks like. So we'll say class, and this will just be mo for month. Okay, so that should help. Let's also go ahead and grab the title while we're here. So I'll give this a class of title as well. And then let's give this a class of description. All right, so let's start with the entire details wrapper first. So let's come down this way. We'll add details. We're just going to make this display grid, give it a little gap, place the item center, and text align everything. Now again, we might as well take advantage of nesting, except in this case, we're going to have a child, which is the amount. It's all this section right here. We'll do display grid. We're going to have 3 different columns, and we'll make sure it only takes up the width it needs. Now that will be important to be grid because we're going to use that to kind of offset everything and position it where we want it to be. Next, we've got 2 children there we need to style. That would be the number and the month. So we'll style it like that. And I guess we didn't really need something on the sign anyhow because it's just going to be the normal size, right? But the rest of these should now work properly. This is down below because we're self-align on the end. And we've got a large font size here and a line height of 1. Okay, so now below the amount, but we're still inside of the details. Typically, I don't nest this far in, but since we're already started, let's just keep going. So we've got the title and we've also got the description. That's one of the nice things about like keeping everything inside of a component, by the way, is like you're already kind of scoping it to that area so you know exactly what the structure will be. So in this case, I'm not going to be reusing these styles anywhere. So in this case, it makes sense. All right, back up to the title. This just needs the font size and we need to make sure it's uppercase. And then for the description, I'm just going to make sure the max width is 60%. Okay, finally, we've got these features sections. So let's come up top here. We probably need to provide some kind of class because I don't think we did that. So that's right here. We'll give this the class of features. And I think this should actually probably be a UL. That makes more sense to me. And then we'll come inside here and have this be an LI. And let's go ahead and call this thing feature. And then we've got 2 different icons. One of them should be green and one of them should be red, I think. Let's come over here. Yeah, green and red. So we can use those styles as well. So I'm going to come in here with a class. We'll just name this green for now. Probably that would be some kind of global declaration, but I'll close this down. And then over here, we'll have the same thing, except this will be red. So down below, let's go ahead and add all that right down here. So features, we'll get rid of the list style and then add margin inline of auto. So that way it stays in the center. We've got a feature inside of that, 3 of them in fact. For there, we're just going to display flex and make sure that they're center aligned. Finally, we've got our 2 colors of green and we've also got red. And for green, we'll just do color accent green. That's one of our variables in the global file. And for red, we'll do color accent red. So now that should look just about correct. All right, so if I've done my math right, that means the only thing we've got left is this button component. Now we've got several different variants here, right? We've got this like background. We've also got just an outline. So there's a bunch of different ways you could style this depending on how versatile this button will be. Obviously, having a bigger site context, knowing where this will be used, gives me a sense of what we should do. So there's no real right or wrong here, but you may want to adjust this according to your needs. Now that I see this, these icons are also a little smaller. I think that's going to annoy me if I don't fix that. So let's come up top and, well, I guess we could just do it on the icons, right? Both green and red. We'll just say like width of like 1 rem. And let's add a little baby gap in here while we're at it. So I'll just do like a gap of 4 pixels. Okay, cool. So let's now actually get over to the button. Now this button, we may want to pass certain things in depending on what it is. So I might want to have like a background color or if it's a primary button or all those kinds of things. So let's actually go to the button itself and scaffold this out. And I'll open back up the pricing cards just so we can think through this. All right, so up top here, let's have a class list. We're going to have several things. So we're going to have a default. We'll just call that button. And I think we should also have like a theme that we pass in. Theme could be something like pro or enterprise or free. Again, in a full site context, I probably would call this like primary or bordered or those kinds of things, but let's just keep it scoped to the actual component and not overcomplicate things. Now let's go ahead and grab the theme right here. And then we should type this, since we're using TypeScript at this point, to actually type this according to the button itself, right? The actual HTML entity. So I'll declare an interface. We'll call it props just so we don't have to assign it. It'll do that for us automatically. We'll just say that this extends the HTML attributes, and the attribute is the button. Now, the one thing I want to make sure I extend is that it has to have a theme. Now, I do actually have a type. We've added that already over in the card right here, this pricing card. If I scroll all the way up top here, you'll see that I actually have a prop right here. Now, one thing I could do is have this extracted so that I can actually export it. So I'll export type. We'll call it like card props or something like that. And we'll export it right here. And then I can just say that this is a type of card prop. And looks like I forgot a curly bracket. Okay, so now that I've got this exported, I can import it into my button. So I'm going to grab my card props and make sure I hit Control and Spacebar and pull that in. and I just want to pick off a single thing, which would be the tier. So every button needs to have a tier. So if I come back over here, we should be able to look at our button and pass that in right here. So the theme should just be the tier. Now, because I'm using TypeScript, I know only one of those three will be passed along. So let's get stuff back up and running. I'm going to close this down. Come down here, we're just going to have our style declaration, and I'm going to paste most of this in, again, because this isn't a CSS course, and I'll just talk you through kind of what I did. So I inherited the font, so we kind of override some of the default styles from the browser, give it a color, a background, and a border based off of these local variables that I've assigned to my defaults, which should be this right over here, whatever that left card is. I've given some other things that are true to all of them, right? They all should be this way. They should all have this transition on it. I've given them hover states and focus visible states as well. And now if I come in here, you'll see that it gets all of that automatically. So what we have to do now is just override the colors and backgrounds and all that for these two buttons. So this should be Pro, and then I've also got Enterprise. So I'll drop the Enterprise in there first, and then also grab the Pro as well. And once again, I forgot my ampersand, so this should have this class in addition to the button class. And I'm not seeing it. I think it's because these are actually uppercase, right? I think like this and like this. Okay, so now we've got both of these coming in properly. Again, you may want to do that differently, and if I was on a bigger site, I probably would as well. Does that look like our finished product? Let's check. I say it's pretty close, all right? And that's kind of what we're going for here, is just styling this and really thinking through how we'd want to template this out with Astro. And so if you did something that looks generally like this, you did a great job. All right, hopefully that helps kind of seeing how I use these as variables as well to template this out. You might be using Tailwind, Sass, Less, whatever else you want to do. That's totally fine as well. This was a totally optional video, and you did a great job. All right, I will see you in the next module where we're going to look at everything to do with MDX and Markdown. Okay, let's go ahead and add TypeScript. Now, I went ahead and kind of faked TypeScript just so I could remember what the properties were called, but now we're going to actually get it in our IntelliSense. Now, where we want it is in this pricing card, and you can see right here, it's even telling us we really need this right here. So what I can do is type all this card data according to the actual data file. Now, I can manually type this out if I want to, or probably the easiest thing to do is just to come over here, whenever we loop over it, where was that? This pricing card, these cards right here, and just grab all this, and we know that this should be what we're wanting, right? This object right here. So let's define it where it's used. That would be in the pricing card. Now you can do an interface or a type, doesn't much matter, but I'm going to come up here and just do type. We'll do props, and then I'll come in here and we're going to name this card data, and then we'll paste in all this stuff. And it looks like I forgot the opening curly bracket. So now the prop should have one item, the card data, and it has all this stuff right here. Now to actually show this, let's move this up top and close that out. And this is how I typically like to do it with my props. Actually, my import's all the way up top, then my props, then astro.props, and then all this stuff right here. Now notice all these will be typed exactly as we want. Now these features right here, they don't know what they are, even though if I come over here, it shows that there's title and checked. So in other words, it's not showing that there's an array of these items. So I might need to come up top here and just make sure that this is an array of these like that. And that should take care of our problem down this way. Yep. Okay, so now we've got everything set up with TypeScript. Now this would have been really helpful if I needed to come in here and check on like my tier or whatever, and now I've got that up here. Actually, it's most helpful probably right here, where I can actually just start typing and it shows all those items. So those are some basic types that would be helpful to us. Now one thing I typically like to do with TypeScript is add aliases. If I come over here to the tsconfig, let's just open up the Astro docs. This is not unique to Astro, but these import aliases can be in TypeScript or JavaScript files, but I usually use them especially in TypeScript configurations. All we have to do is define a base URL under compiler options and then provide different paths. This makes it easier if you're moving around components. You don't have to worry about the import like spots where they're at. You can just drag them right in here. Wherever you move them, they'll all work as long as they're relative to like your src directory, your root directory. Now they've got components and layouts. What I'm going to do is just come over here and get rid of the components. We're just going to say anything with an @ will then point to src / like that. Now, why is this actually helpful? Well, if I come over here, what I can do is replace all of this with just @components button. And then even if I move this pricing card component around to somewhere else in my project, it will always reference the button in the right place. I don't have to worry about changing around those imports. The last thing I want to show you is how to use Astro check. Now, if I come over here to my package.json, you'll notice that I've got an Astro build command, but I can also use an Astro check command. Now I can just type it in if I want, or we could come in here and add like check, and this would be Astro check. Now check actually looks at all your types and ensures that your whole project works. So let's come over here. We're going to say npm run check, and it will run all those type checks. Now I might have to install something first, and then you'll notice I get 0 errors, 0 warnings, and 0 hints. If I open back up that pricing card component and we remove this right here, we should actually have a warning, and it will actually prevent building when we get around to that. So if I go check, you'll notice now it should give me 3 errors, right? These 3 errors are telling me that this doesn't match the type it's expecting. Now, so far we've ignored all the styling. That's why it just looks like this. In the next video, I'm going to give you a sample of how I might style something like this. Again, if you're just focused on Astro, move on by. But if you want to practice some UI, you're welcome to stick with me through this video.